Today is going to be an introduction. Now, we're not going to get into it. It's just going to be an introduction because there's much. There is only 12 chapters. But within these 12 chapters, we're going to find much going on and much happening. So, turn to the book of Daniel. Turn to the book of Daniel. I know Pastor's been threatening to get into it. Last time we were in this was several years ago, and I think we spent, over a year in the book of Daniel. It was some time because there's much going on. Well, there's some things of which we are to understand here. One is that your name. Now, who in here knows the meaning of your name? Okay, and your meaning of your name is, the meaning of your name is messenger of peace. Okay, anyone else? Okay. Jehovah is gracious. It's Joshua. Yeah, Yehoshua. Yes, that's why. By the way, Joshua's name was not Joshua or Yehoshua. It was Oshea. And the reason why, if you look at Numbers chapter 12 and 13, in Numbers 13 you have the big list of the 12 people that went into the promised land, and then down on the bottom it says, and God changed Oshea's name to Yehoshua or Joshua. Oshea means God is salvation in the Old Testament, but Joshua means that Christ is salvation in the New Testament. And twice in the book of Hebrews we see that Christ is mentioned as Yehoshua. So we have to remind ourselves when we read the book of Hebrews that it's speaking of Christ and not Joshua himself. But it's interesting that eventually you become what your name means. And so my name means leader. It's incredible, but that's just what it is. All right, so again, this is just an introduction. Okay, so we'll be going to many places. I'll be introducing you to many dates because we're going to find that the dating is going to be important. By the way, before I get into this, I'm not trying to belay services here, but and I know I've mentioned it in the past, but have you heard of these caves called the Qumran Caves? Okay, so the Qumran Caves, we find that as there's a little shepherd boy who was bored to tears because all he was doing was just watching the sheep, which, by the way, you can only see the sheep go so many times. Every time they do that, they stick their tongue out. Okay? It's just crazy, like they got to stick their tongue out at someone. Anyway, so a little boy was throwing rocks into these caves, and he heard something go crack. He crawls up there and checks them out and gets the authorities, and they found today what we understand as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so, now the reason I bring that up is because when we get to the book of Daniel, we are going to find that the critics say that it's much too accurate to be written in the time in which Daniel wrote it. But when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Daniel. Much more they found. By the way, has anyone ever seen any of the portion of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Okay, I had the opportunity to go to Seattle and saw they had an exhibit of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you could only view it for 2-3 seconds at a time because this light would come on and then it would go off. And this light would come on because they didn't want to expose it to the light because it's fragile. And so, but the book of Daniel was there, and the critics had to accept that it was written by Daniel. And so, let's get into, again, this is just an introduction. First of all, what does his name mean? Well, Daniel means God is my judge. God is my judge. Okay? He was a person of deep abiding faith. Okay? How do we know this? At a young age, look to Daniel chapter 1 and there in verse 8. at a young age, he purposed in the Bible says his heart. Okay? He was a person of deep abiding faith. How do we know this? Remember, and I want to stress this, okay? This is very important for us to understand. Prior to the book of Daniel, we don't know anything of his life. The only thing that we know of is that he came from the king's court, possibly royal blood, okay? More than likely king's court. But prior to that, we don't know. The Bible doesn't indicate that he was able to interpret dreams like Joseph was. Joseph at a young age, age 15, was able not only to have the dream but interpret the dream. That was the whole point of, we see that during those dreams that Joseph says that I had a dream and the sheaves had bowed down to me, indicating that his brothers who were elder than him are going to bow down to him. Again, I'm not going to get into the book of Genesis, but look, we find that we only see what we know to be happening at the time that it's happening, and that is that Daniel now, with purpose of heart, don't want to defile himself. Again, Daniel chapter 1, look there to verse 8. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, let me just, I'm not going to get into the Levitical law. We can, but it's not necessary. So in the Levitical law, God very clearly distinguishes what's clean and what's dirty. Okay? So, in saying that, now I always get people with this, okay? How did the animals go on the ark? You sure? If it was a clean animal, it went on by sevens. 2, 4, 6, and a sacrifice. Because we don't want Mrs. Whoever to have not a Mr. Okay? Sooner or later, they're not going to have a Mr. So very clearly we see, even in Genesis, the clean and the dirty. The dirty went on 2 by 2s because they weren't supposed to sacrifice them, but the clean went on by sevens, not pairs, but sevens, so you had an oddball. And so if one went up there without an oddball, I can just imagine, the talking, hey, this guy, I know what's going to happen to him, okay? But don't tell him, he may not know at the moment. So here we have, okay, so the reason I bring that up, I'm hoping to get through this today. I don't think I'm going to. The reason I bring that up is because here Daniel says that he purposed in his heart that he didn't want to defile himself. So is a pig an unclean animal? Okay, now Antiochus Epiphanes, how would you like to be that kid in kindergarten? How do you spell your name? I don't know. Nobody knows. Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes had sacrificed a pig on the altar. And that was considered like the Antichrist. And so we know that here in Babylon, since they have conquered many of the nations, their dietary habits were not according to what the Jews are. So Daniel says, I don't want to defile myself with the unclean things of which the law says that we are not supposed to do. So what does he do? The Bible says at an early age, because he was a man of faith, he did not want to defile himself. Okay? Now, this is at a young age. Now, depending on who you read, it'll be anywhere between age 12 to 17. Nobody really knows. But somewhere in there, 12 to 17, this is how young Daniel is. Okay? And so, as a youth, again, he purposed not to defile himself. Daniel 1:8. When he was old, he persisted in serving God, even despite the threats on his life. Okay, how do we know that? Look at Daniel chapter 6. Okay, now, just stay with me. Daniel chapter 6, look there to verse 10. When he was a youth, he purposed not to defile himself. When he was older, he still had that purpose of life, and we see that not only did he want to serve God, but he wanted to serve God even though it was going to cost him his life. Daniel chapter 6, there in verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he knelt upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Let me just look. This is when he's old, so we're going to find out through Daniel's life that God is going to bring him to a position not only to serve kings, but he's also going to be a counselor. We find that later on in his life, even though it was a horrible king, the king called upon him because there's this big incident of the writing of the wall. Meeny, meeny, tickle you farson is what the hand wrote. He comes in, he's a counselor again, even though he's an old man. And but by the way, we are going to find that the things of which were the king wanted to give him, Daniel says, you keep them. Okay, I do not need them. So at a young age, we see he did not want to defile himself. At an old age, chapter 6, verse 10, we find that he still wanted to serve God. By the way, I keep losing my train of thought here. By the way, did the temple exist? Temple's destroyed. How do we know? Book of Lamentations. We find that Nebuchadnezzar comes in the 3rd time. Now, again, we're going to set some dates to these things, okay? Because it's very important to know. The fall of Nineveh kind of is the key to set all these dates up. And when Nineveh, 612, okay, is when Nineveh is going to fall. So we kind of have a good idea where the rest of the dates are going to fall into play. But we also know that Nebuchadnezzar comes in not once, not twice, but 3 times. And we know that at the 3rd time, if you look at Daniel chapter 1, very clearly you see that because of the sin and the idolatry and the hard-heartedness, and the Bible says over and over and over again that their sinews were as steel. They didn't want to bow their head to God, and their forehead were as hard as flint. That's why God says that I had to set the prophet's head as hard as flint because of the people. They were hard-hearted. They were hard-necked. Still today, they are blind, and they do not want to see the Messiah. But look, we find here that the temple did not exist, but did that keep Daniel from worshiping? No, he did not. So we see that when he was old, he still persisted in serving God, even though it meant his life. God blessed Daniel because of his faith. He rose to some heights of popularity in not only in the Babylonian kingdom, but in the Persian kingdom. So we are going to get to a point in the book of Daniel where Nebuchadnezzar, okay, now Nebuchadnezzar was not the first king of Babylon. What we're going to find is Nebuchadnezzar was the first king of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar, the son, he was in battling Egypt. And so when the battle was won, Nebuchadnezzar his father had died. he comes back, they make him king, and we find that the book of Daniel says, and God gave into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar Jehoiakim's kingdom. Why? Because God warned him. Remember, the book of Hosea tells us that that God had warned the northern kingdom, but in the northern kingdom they did not want to submit. So God brought in the Assyrians. We find that's where these people come. The Samaritans. They were half Jewish. They were half Samaritan, and they knew the truth because they were the northern kingdom. They knew what the law meant. But as you follow them down through the history, you'll find that in John chapter 4, it got to the point where the truth now has been corrupted. And in that corruption, Jesus tells the Samaritan woman, he says, you worship ye know not what. They knew the truth, but because of the Assyrians coming in, idolatry worship, and then falling away from the truth, we see that now they have no idea what they worship, and Jesus tells them that. So, look, we see a lot of things going on, but we know that Daniel is going to give some answers to Nebuchadnezzar about this image, the image of gold, silver, gold, silver, bronze, and the legs of brass and clay. And we know that Daniel says that the head of gold is Babylon, the arms and the chest is the Medes and the Persians. That's where we get that Daniel has arose to power in both Babylon and Persia. Daniel chapter 2, look there to verse 48. Okay, again, I'm jumping all over the place, but this is just an introduction, and we'll probably continue this next week because I don't think I'm going to get through it today. There's quite a bit here. So he rose to great heights in both Babylon and in Persia. Daniel chapter 2, there in verse 48. Then the king made Daniel a great man and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Now, who remembers the Christmas story? Okay. Who came from the east? Okay, now that's what we call them, but is that the proper name for them? The Magi. The Magi would be the proper name for them. We understand the wise men, okay? If they came from the east, most scholars believe they would come from Babylon. If they came from Babylon, who taught them? Daniel. There's going to come a time when the Messiah is going to be born. Now, let me see here. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, I'll use these. With purpose of heart, the Magi came for one reason, and they stuck with their faith and the one reason. The Magi would come with paperclip, glasses to see by, and a drink because I'm thirsty. We understand it as frankincense, myrrh, and gold, prophet, priest, and king. We understand that, but I want to use these illustrations, okay? So the Magi comes, and like most of the world, where do they place the Magi? At the manger. Were they there? Where were they? Read it carefully. It says that no longer, it says the child, not an infant. Okay, so we know at least 2 years. So they had searched for 2 years. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because when they came, they still had the 3 gifts of which they brought. They did not say, oh, look at this one here. Man, this is so much cooler than my paperclip. I'm going to bring the Lord a book. They didn't do that. What they brought was they continued with the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, the reason I hammer on this is because you look in the Old Testament, and at every opportunity that the children of Israel had their worship diverted to someplace else, they began to worship that deity. Just like Balaam was asked of Balak, how can I cause the children of Israel to stumble? Well, you just get these young fillies out there, and they will be drawn to them, and you will draw them away from their God. And that's exactly what happened. So we see at every turn that the children of Israel found something else to worship. God had to bring them back, and again and again and again. We may have read this little book called the Book of Judges. Again and again and again. But we see here that as Daniel rises to power, he is in charge of the providence of Babylon, which means the Magi. Not only here, but Daniel chapter 6. In Daniel chapter 6, look there to verse 1. So here we have Nebuchadnezzar. Again, that would be the Babylonian kingdom. Now we see there's another kingdom that would arise, and that's exactly what Daniel would say when Daniel is revealing to the king about the image. He says, Daniel, he says, O King Nebuchadnezzar, live forever. He says, you're the head, but there's going to come a kingdom less inferior than yours, and they are the arms and the chest, and that'd be the Medes and the Persians. Babylon was thought to be impenetrable. There was a river that ran underneath the wall and through Babylon. They thought it was impenetrable. But the the Medes and the Persians, they would dig contributaries off that river, lowering the river, and then they would crawl underneath the wall, and that's where we find that where the king drank and worshiped the God of stone, the God of wood, and the God of iron, and God says, meeny, tickle, you farson, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and that night the king died. So we see that in Daniel chapter 2, verse 48. It's the Babylonian kingdom, but now in chapter 6, it says, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should not have damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because of the excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Now, what does this sound like? Maybe you read this book called the Book of Esther. We know that the Queen Vashti had the whole congregation was drunk. The king wanted to parade herself before the congregation. She said that she wouldn't do it, and so the king says, you're no longer queen. And so we find that to go get the virgins, it took, I believe, over a year to get them prepared. But if you read any history on that, you see that the women would come before the king, and they would be arrayed so much with gold that they can just barely stand up as they're presenting themselves. But when it came to this girl called Esther, she says, I don't want any of that. When she presented herself to the king, what drew the king to her? Spirit of God. Just like we find in Daniel here, where the king says there's a spirit within him that is better than any wise men or magi that I know of. By the way, as we get through this incident of the image, you will find that Daniel could have said, yeah, you take care of those magi and I'll be the only one left. It's not what he said. He says, don't kill the magi and I will tell you what the king's dream was all about. He was concerned about them. Look, we see that as a youth, he purposed not to defile himself. When he's old, he persisted, even though it meant his life. He rose to great heights in kingdoms, in the Babylonian kingdom, in the Persian kingdom. Daniel was contemporary with Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Look at Ezekiel chapter 1. Go to your left a little bit. Okay? Ezekiel chapter 1. Now, in this great chapter of the book of Ezekiel, and you'll find throughout the early writings of Ezekiel, you'll find that Ezekiel writes this about these beasts of which Revelation tells us about. Revelation chapter 4, Revelation chapter 5. We also see that in Ezekiel chapter 10, Ezekiel chapter 1, that he mentions these creatures that are just out of this world. Hollywood probably couldn't come up with something like this. But again, I'm not going to get into the book of Ezekiel, but look at Ezekiel chapter 1, and we see very clearly that Daniel, Ezekiel, and also Jeremiah, because Daniel says, I knew from the books that we would be there 70 years, okay? That's 70 years. But here in Ezekiel chapter 1, look how Ezekiel starts off his book. Now it came to pass in the 30th year of the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the what? The captives by the river Shabar, that the heavens were opened and I saw visions open. Okay, notice the age. It's not there by mistake. It is there by purpose of design. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month. So we know that here Ezekiel is 34 years old, 4 months, and the 5th day. Why is that important? We are going to find that God is going to use Ezekiel as a prophet, but a priest. What was the age of what priests had to begin their ministry? 30 years old. So we see Ezekiel says, I was 30 and some months and some days. So God begins to use him, and as he begins to use him in this great chapter of chapter 1 of Ezekiel, you'll see that he begins to describe these creatures. It has a man's body, but instead of our feet, as you look down at your toes, they had calves' foot. Okay? And they had 4 faces. And the faces was the face of a lion, a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle. Now, that's important for us to understand. Why is that important for us to understand? Because it explains the 4 Gospels to us. As you open the book of Matthew, what does Matthew start off with? That long genealogy. You'll find that when you get out of the book of Daniel, when you get into the book of Zechariah, as you get through Zechariah and those prophets that are prophesying after the captivity, and we find that when the temple's rebuilt, in order to get into the temple, you had to prove your genealogy. You didn't prove your genealogy, you didn't go in. So to the Jew, genealogy is everything. What does Matthew prove in the genealogy of Jesus Christ? There in the book of Matthew, that Christ is king. He's the lion. Okay? It's not what it's not what Mark says. It's what Mark doesn't say. Matthew, Luke, and John all have genealogies. Mark does not have one, because nobody cares about a genealogy of a slave or a servant. Jesus said, I came to I came to serve, not to be served. That's that whole topic that we see Jesus in the upper room donning that towel because he was taken on the form of a servant. If you go to an individual's house, they wore sandals, they wore robes. It's a dusty area. So when they come into a home, there'd be a servant that would come. They'd have and wash their feet and wash up towards their calves so they can enter into the home. Jesus began to wash. He says, look, I'm going to teach you a lesson. And that lesson is servitude. And as we find that Jesus gets to Peter, Peter knew what position the Lord put himself in. And Peter says, you're not washing my feet. You're no servant. You're God Almighty. And Jesus says, Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part of heaven with me. Wash my hands and my head. Wash all of me. Friend, when I stand behind that pulpit, I'm just a servant of God. That's all that I am. I'd be much happier if I would just be called a servant instead of pastor. That's all that I am. But we find that very clearly that here in Daniel, it was the servant's heart of which Daniel had. Here, I was going through the books. So Matthew, in that long genealogy, proves that Christ is king. In Mark, he's the servant. In the book of Luke, we see that's the face. The face represents God's humanity towards mankind. We see that very clearly. You go through the book of Revelation. Now, we'll get there. I know some people are chomping to get there, but we've got to get through this first. But look, in serving, you go through the book of Revelation, John says again and again and again, I saw thousands and thousands. I saw 10,000 and 10,000 and thousands of thousands, and they worship God. And the beasts turn and they worship Christ. The elders that sat on the throne now turn and worship Christ. Hebrews chapter 1 tells the angels, you worship the Son, because in Exodus chapter 20, thou shalt have no other gods before me. We know that according to John chapter 8 and verse 58, before Abraham was, I am. He was that individual on top of that mountain. You get to the book of the book of Galatians. Paul clearly identifies him as Genesis chapter 1:1, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. He is the creator. But he left all of that at the Father's feet. He didn't bring one angel to praise him. He didn't even bring one piece of gold, silver, or anything from the foundations of New Jerusalem. What he brought was his humility before God, before mankind. He was born in a manger, the God of the universe, that could have had all the comfort of the world. And yet, what does he do? In humbleness of heart. That's why John says, Jesus is meek and lowly in heart. Take my yoke upon you, for it is made for you. So very clearly we see that Matthew identifies him as the lion. We see Mark identifies him as the ox. The ox is representative of a servant. Don't get that ox confused. Once we get to the book of Revelation, it says calf. They're interchangeable. Okay, we see the lion. We see the ox. We see the man. We see the eagle. The eagle is representative of deity. You go through the Bible, and the Bible speaks of the eagle as being deity. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was what? And the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. And there was nothing made that was made. That's what Paul's talking about when he says that he is the creator. There was nothing made that was made. And yet we see that through the Scriptures that Jesus tells us, I was with him when the mountains were formed. We find very clearly that Job says it doesn't say angels. It says the sons of God shouted for joy that it was done, that creation had come into existence. So, look, we see here that God is my judge. He purposed not in his heart, not only in the young age, but the old age of Babylon and both Persia. And I've often said, it's every one of us has a testimony. But your testimony, it's important, but your testimony speaks volumes after you leave the room. How do we know? Read the book of Daniel. We'll get there. Because the king was worried about Daniel, thinking about Daniel all night. He gets now to the cave, and after they'd rolled that stone away, Daniel, the God whom thou servest. Daniel's testimony spoke volumes. Daniel was contemporary with Ezekiel, Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel prophesied in Babylon among the exiles. Now, when I give you these dates, I want us to understand something. That if we are in the Old Testament and we start off here, say at 600, the closer we get to the cross, the more it's going to count down. Okay. In the New Testament, the further we get from the cross, it's going to go up. So here we have that. Just so we understand this, Jeremiah prophesied in Jerusalem before and during the Babylonian exile from 626 to 628. Now, it should be 628 to 626, but anyway. Ezekiel prophesied from 592 to 570. Clearly within that realm. And other than what we see in Daniel, we don't really know anything outside unless you get into some historical books. Like, for instance, there's one chapter in the Bible, I believe it's Daniel chapter 4. It's unlike any other chapter in all the Bible. Why? Because it's the testimony of one man. The whole chapter. It's a testimony of one man called Nebuchadnezzar. And we get there and we see that in that testimony, we see that God, in this dream of this tree, there's fowls above it, there's animals underneath of it, and the Holy One had come down and hewed down the tree and put a band of band of brass around it, and the king didn't know what that meant, so he talked to Daniel, and Daniel was astonished. And look, just a quick synopsis. We'll get there. But we see that Daniel says God has given you 12 months to straighten your act up because of his pride. Hey, I conquered all this and that and the other thing. Hey, it's all by me. God says, really? Read Daniel chapter 1, which didn't exist quite then, okay? But God gave into Nebuchadnezzar's hand the kingdom of Jehoiakim, okay? Jehoiakim was the king of Judah at that time. And so we see that, and again, I'm just touching on these areas, but we see that at the end of the 12 months, as Nebuchadnezzar is going through his kingdom, he says, who's made this kingdom? Was it not for my glory? Did not I do it? And God says, that's enough out of you. And so God took his mind, took his heart, and he goes out in the field and eats grass for 7 years. The Bible says 7 times passed over him. That means 7 years. You read any historical books, who took care of him? Daniel. And what we find is At the end of that 7 years, we'll get into his testimony. But I believe when I get to heaven, I'll see Nebuchadnezzar there. He understood who God was. Probably more so than most people, because he lived it. Okay? And so, I haven't even got like the first little bit of Daniel. So we'll continue this next week. This introduction, look, these are just some highlights. These are just some things, but we'll get into some deeper things just as soon as we get through this introduction. But I see a lot of people doing this, like, yes, I know that, Pastor. Come on, let's get to the meat. Well, we'll get to the meat, okay, but we just need to cover this so that we know what we're expecting. And again, there's going to be some dates that I'll give you. But what's important about the book of Daniel is one, it teaches us how to be a servant under difficult times. And he certainly was. The Magi wanted to knock him off because the king liked Daniel more than them. Now, you remember that, and I think they still have them out. That the veggie story, the Veggie Tales. Yeah, there's a little song about Daniel, you know. Oh, king likes Daniel more than me and you, or something like that. Oh, it's just so funny. It's so funny. My daughter can probably sing it. You know, she has all that knack, but she says, Dad, that's not how it goes. It teaches us how to be a servant, sometimes in difficult times, but it also teaches us some important lessons of what we have to learn before we get to the book of Revelation, because there's much imagery in Revelation and in Daniel, but if we're going to understand Revelation, we must first understand Daniel. So we'll get through it. All right, let's have prayer.